Hello students, we are going to continue on in our chapter 5 notes, lesson 2, Uniting the Colonists. So I am going to begin here under trouble in Massachusetts in our text. Now you'll notice again, we started doing the kinds of questions that we have the answer, and then we're going to be figuring out what the question should be to go along with it to help us work on some higher order thinking skills. And so we have under trouble in Massachusetts, our answer is Great Britain was afraid colonists would start a rebellion. So we need to read to find out what our question should be for that. So under trouble in Massachusetts, protests continued to flare in the colonies, making British officials nervous. In 1768, they sent word to Britain that the colonies were on the brink of rebellion, a rejection of British authority. Parliament sent troops to Boston. As angry colonists jeered, the Redcoats set up camp in the center of the city. So we're going to see if we can figure out what our question should be here. So Great Britain was afraid colonists would start a rebellion. They were afraid colonists would start a rebellion. So what could our question be that would give us that answer from our text that we read here? And let's see here. This was a reaction to something. So their reaction, we're going to kind of make this backwards here. Here we go. Parliament sent troops to Boston. So is this the reason that Parliament sent troops to Boston? Yes, it is. Because they were afraid that colonists would start a rebellion. So our question here is going to be, why were British troops sent to Boston? Number 2 is, why did the colonists think Britain had pushed them too far? So for this one, we actually need to read further. So I'm going to scroll down here. And for many colonists, the British Act went too far. First, the colonists were convinced that the British had passed laws that violated colonial rights. Now Britain had sent an army to occupy or take control of colonial cities. So it really, that's what this whole paragraph is, that the British Act went too far. And what is it that they did that went too far? Well, let's see here. They passed laws that violated colonial rights. And then they sent an army to occupy their colonial cities. And remember that GB is Great Britain. I think at this point, I don't need to be adding that into the notes anymore. If you are unsure of that, then please type in Great Britain, but otherwise you can put GB in your notes. So we started our last topic on talking about the no taxation without representation in the colonies. And again, their whole idea behind that is that they didn't have anybody to share their point of view in Parliament. And so for that reason, these laws were violating their rights because they weren't able to share their opinions on how things should be done in the colonies. And not to mention, they live there in the colonies, and the people in the Parliament have never set foot in America, right? I mentioned that in our last lesson as well. So we're going to move forward here to tension in the streets, because these are making things more tense between the colonists and between the British. And then especially having these troops sent there, there's going to be even more stuff going on. So it says to describe the events that occurred in Boston on March 5th, 1770. So let's see here. Well, I'll finish reading off this other part first. To make matters worse, the soldiers in Boston acted rudely. The Redcoats, who are mostly poor men, earned little pay. Some stole from local shops and got into fights with colonists. Also, in their off hours, the soldiers competed for jobs that Bostonians wanted. So lots of things going on between the soldiers and the colonists. And now to tension in the streets. On March 5th, 1770, violence erupted. A fight broke out between some Bostonians and soldiers. As British officers tried to calm the crowd, a man shouted, "We did not send for you. We will not have you here. We'll get rid of you. We'll drive you away." The angry townspeople surged forward. They began throwing sticks and stones at the soldiers. "Come on, you rascals, you bloody backs, you lobster scoundrels, fire if you dare," someone in the crowd shouted. After one soldier was knocked down, the nervous redcoats did fire. They killed 5 colonists. Among the dead was Crispus Attucks, a dock worker who was part African, part Native American. One Bostonian cried, "Are the inhabitants to be knocked down in the streets? Are they to be murdered?" The colonists called the tragic encounter the Boston Massacre. So I think you've probably heard about the Boston Massacre before. And this is a major event that took place in our history here before the Revolutionary War. So notice that I've got several different bullets here that we're going to kind of put this together piece by piece. Now, here's the thing about the Boston Massacre and really about any event that takes place in history. These are all based on the accounts of eyewitnesses, okay? And anybody who witnesses an event does so differently. We all perceive things a little bit differently in our mind's eye. So we could all have been standing there and watching these events unfold and take place, but we would remember different things about those events. And some of them might not even be true. They might not even be right. And it's not because you're lying about them. It's because you thought that you saw something that maybe you didn't actually really see. So in events where, you know, maybe there was a crime that was committed and police officers question witnesses and they ask for a description of the person, somebody might say, yes, I saw this person run out of the scene, we'll say. They ran from the scene that we think was probably the person who committed the crime. And they had brown hair and they were wearing a army fatigue kind of jacket and matching pants and then some boots, right? And then the next person might say, oh yeah, I saw this person too. But no, he had black hair and he was wearing a jean jacket and army fatigue pants. So they might see things a little bit differently, okay? And sometimes details matter, and sometimes we just have different accounts of the story. So we don't have one story that's exactly the same about the Boston Massacre. So if you read about this or hear about this from another source, it may sound a little bit different. And I'm going to even tell you some different things from what's in the textbook here. So the first thing that we're going to include here is that this was a fight that broke out between the colonists and the soldiers in front of a tax collection house. So the location is kind of important. And remember, the whole thing is that we're complaining about the taxes. And so these colonists are gathered outside of the tax collection house because they're protesting, right? And so these soldiers are also there out in front of the house, the tax collection house. So the colonists start throwing rocks and sticks. In some versions of the story, they also talk about throwing snow and ice because it's March in Boston. It's sometimes snowy, it's sometimes cold. So there are some different versions of this part of the story as well. And then they started calling the soldiers names like lobsterbacks. In the text here, it says, you rascals, you bloody backs, you lobster scoundrels, okay? But lobsterback was a common term used that was a derogatory term toward the British soldiers. And of course, they were called the lobsterbacks because they wore red uniforms, red coated uniforms. And so, we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on too. And oftentimes they were also just referred to as red coats because that's what they wore. Okay, so they were throwing rocks and sticks at the soldiers. They were calling them names. They were kind of taunting them. Okay, and so then the next thing that happened was that soldiers panicked and a shot was fired that nobody knows. Nobody can account for where that shot was actually fired from. They believe it was a soldier, but that's not really 100%. So the shot was fired. And then, well, what happens if one shot is fired? If other people have guns, more people are going to start shooting. So remember that colonists pretty much all own weapons, and probably have them with them as well, but also every one of the soldiers has a gun, right? So when one shot was fired, then more shots were fired to follow. This really was kind of just like a ball of confusion. Nobody really knew what was going on in this quick scuffle that took place, really. And so in the end, and they a lot of times say, like, when the dust cleared afterward, there were 5 colonists that ended up dead. And then this is called the Boston Massacre. Now, the name of this is an important piece to the story as well, and we're going to get into that into the next part here. But then another piece that we're going to add on is that John Adams is Samuel Adams' cousin. So Samuel Adams, we already talked about, was the leader of the Sons of Liberty, the group that was made to protest British policies. And John Adams is Samuel's cousin, but he was also a lawyer, and he ended up actually defending the soldiers in their trial for the murder of these 5 colonists. Now, John Adams, you're also going to hear more about later as well. He's going to play a larger role here in history. And then, in fact, he will become one of our early presidents of the United States. I'm going to give you a moment to make sure that you have all of that text typed in to your notes. So at the conclusion of this lesson, I also am going to show you a video clip of the Boston Massacre that is like a reenactment of what happened during that time. And we'll do that once we finish getting our information for it. So I'm going to move forward here as you are hopefully finishing up that typing. And we're moving into the next heading called Spreading the News. And our first question here is, what is propaganda? And this is stuff that's also going to have to do with the Boston Massacre. So I'm going to read first, and then I'll switch the page in case you're still typing some of that information. So again, we're looking for what is propaganda. Colonial leaders used the killings as propaganda, information designed to influence opinion. Samuel Adams put up posters that described the Boston Massacre as a slaughter of innocent Americans by bloodthirsty redcoats. Paul Revere made an engraving that showed a British officer giving the order to open fire on an orderly crowd. So I'm going to pause there in the reading. I'm going to move forward here. Propaganda, we have highlighted here in yellow that's information designed to influence public opinion. So I also like to include in here a little bit extra to help you, focus on what propaganda really is, that in most cases, there is some form of an exaggeration that's used in this information, and that it's a lot like a tabloid magazine. So, when you hear some kind of like crazy rumors about people, especially like celebrities in these tabloids or on things that are on the internet now, is probably more likely where you read information about celebrities. They are typically based on a piece of truth, but then they really sort of stretch it and twist it to make it seem either better than it is or worse than it is, depending on how they want to sway the public opinion. And so that's what we're talking about here, that the colonists are really going to take advantage of this situation. And so number 2, how did the colonial leaders use the Boston Massacre as propaganda? Well, they did a couple things. And we first of all are talking about Samuel Adams, and we just mentioned that, remember, Samuel Adams is the leader of the Sons of Liberty. And so he put up posters that described the Boston Massacre as a slaughter of innocent colonists by bloodthirsty redcoats, okay? So now think about our description that we just typed in about what the Boston Massacre actually was, the real events that took place, that this was a small fight that took place between some colonists and some soldiers, that somebody panicked and fired maybe accidentally into the crowd. Then, of course, when one shot is fired, more shots are going to follow. So it was just really some confusion that was going on. Did it seem like a slaughter by bloodthirsty redcoats? And of course, the redcoats again are referring to the soldiers. When you think about the word slaughter, you should think about something really violent and really gruesome and like done purposely. You are murdering someone purposely with a slaughter, and you're doing it in a cruel, maybe inhumane type of way. Does that sound like an accurate description of the Boston Massacre, of what we just put in our notes? No, it doesn't. Now, also, let's look at this other keyword here, innocent. Did the colonists seem to be innocent to you in that situation? The answer should be no. They were not innocent. Now, by any means, they did not deserve to be shot at or to be killed, 100%. But they were not innocent in the situation. They were the ones who actually began the conflict. They were taunting, throwing things, and saying things to the soldiers. And they didn't really know what to do. They didn't really know how to react. So it's even said that the soldier that was believed to have actually fired that first shot may have been bumped into by someone or pushed by someone, and it was almost like a knee-jerk reaction that they fired their weapon, not intentionally. So again, it's not what Samuel Adams is portraying at all, okay? But like I said, they're taking advantage of this because they want to use this to get more people against Great Britain. They want more people to be able to have this power against Great Britain. So they're going to spread the word this way. Now, Paul Revere is also going to make an engraving, which is basically like a painting that showed a British officer giving the order to fire on an orderly crowd. So once again, that word orderly comes up in there, that they were doing nothing wrong, minding their own business. And then all of a sudden the British troops came in and they were given the order to just fire in on this crowd that was minding their own business. And that's not what happened. But this is how they're spreading the information, right? So even though it's based on truth, there was a conflict between the crowd and the soldiers. There were people who were killed. Were they murdered? Was it ordered for them to do? No, but this is what they're doing to spread this information. So number 3, I believe I need to, yes, I'm going to need to read. So how did the Boston Massacre affect the colonists? The Boston Massacre led colonists to call for stronger boycotts of British goods. Troubled by the growing opposition in the colonies, Parliament repealed all the taxes imposed by the Townshend Acts on British imported goods, except the one on tea. In response, the colonists ended their boycotts, except on tea. Trade with Britain resumed. So our answer for this is, how did the Boston Massacre affect colonists? Well, it comes right here in the first sentence. They created a stronger boycott on British goods. Remember, this is the way that they're going to be able to actually hurt Great Britain, is through their, we'll call it through their pocketbook, through their wallet. They're going to hit them where it counts as far as money is concerned, because money is part of what's going to give a country power and control. And so they're not going to be necessarily able to fight against the British soldiers, but they're going to be able to hurt Great Britain itself at the core by taking away their opportunity to make money. So how does the Parliament react? Well, the Parliament does what the colonists were hoping, and they repeal all of the taxes on imported goods except for the tax on tea. So we had talked about in a last lesson that the Townshend Act put a tax on things that were imported, like lead and glass and paper and tea, and actually silk also, but we only listed a few things. Tea was one of the important ones. So they took the taxes off of the paper and the glass and the other things, but they left it on the tea. And again, Parliament knows that this is going to be harder for the colonists to live without. And so they remained keeping that tax on the tea. Our next question, what was the Committee of Correspondence and when was it established? So we're going to need to read the next paragraph. Still, some colonists continued to call for resistance to British rule. In 1772, Samuel Adams revived the Boston Committee of Correspondence, a group used in earlier protests. The group circulated calls for action against Britain. Soon, committees of correspondence sprang up throughout the colonies, bringing together protesters opposed to British measures. So, correspondence means basically communication. I'm going to correspond with you about something. We're going to talk about something. But the way for them to talk about something back in these days was either face-to-face in person, or they had to send information through paper, right? Letters, that kind of stuff. So they sent circulated information to other colonies, and this was coming from Massachusetts. Most of these major events are going to take place in Massachusetts, specifically Boston. And so they spread their political ideas to gain more support against Great Britain. Just like up above with Sam Adams and Paul Revere having this propaganda, these people in the Committee of Correspondence are also sending out this same information to all the other colonies. They wanted everyone to know what was taking place in Boston, Massachusetts with the colonists and the British soldiers so that they could gain more support. They're going to start seeing then the soldiers as bloodthirsty and who are just going to go in and shoot people for no real reason, which is going to scare everyone else into wanting to act against them. So the Committee of Correspondence, it doesn't tell us there in the information, was established on November 2nd, 1772. And so they're sending this information all throughout the other colonies through posters, through pamphlets, through letters, through newspapers, through the mail. They're going to be sending all this information. I'm going to leave that there for a second to make sure that you have that last piece. And you are not going to submit yet. Notice that we still have more to this lesson too. We're going to pause in our notes for here today.